They thought they knew exactly what Jamaica was. A small island, a tourist destination, somewhere you go to drink rum punch on a beach and forget about your problems for a week. A place that needs America far more than America needs it. A country that would smile, nod, and quietly accept whatever Washington decided to do to it. Because what choice does a tiny island of less than 3 million people really have? That is exactly what they thought. And that assumption, that comfortable, arrogant, decades-old assumption, is precisely why what is happening right now has caught the most powerful government on the face of the earth completely off guard. Because Jamaica did not smile and nod. Jamaica looked Washington directly in the eye, assessed its options with cold strategic clarity, and began building a future that does not require America's permission. And Washington has no idea how to respond to that. Over the next 30 minutes, I am going to take you through one of the most important and most underreported stories in the entire Western Hemisphere right now. You are going to understand what America actually did to Jamaica, not the sanitized diplomatic version, but the full picture. You are going to understand how Jamaica responded, why that response has quietly terrified policymakers in Washington, and what it means for every Caribbean nation watching from the sidelines. This is not a story about one small island picking a fight it cannot win. This is a story about the moment a small island realized it no longer had to fight on anyone else's terms. Let us begin. On the 21st of January 2026, the United States Department of State released an announcement that landed in the Caribbean like a grenade. Effective immediately, all immigrant visa processing for citizens of 75 countries was suspended indefinitely. No new processing, no scheduled restart. No clear explanation of when or whether normal service would resume. 75 countries is a long list, but the way the announcement was framed, the specific language used to justify it, made something very clear to anyone paying attention. This was not simply a bureaucratic pause. This was a message. The official justification given by the State Department for singling out certain nations, including Jamaica, was that their citizens posed a high risk of becoming dependent on public assistance once inside the United States. Read that again slowly because it is extraordinary. The United States government looked at Jamaica, a country whose citizens living and working in America send $3,490 million back home every single year, and called them potential welfare cases. $3.49 billion in remittances in a single year. Money earned through labor, money transferred voluntarily from worker to family. Money that represents nearly 20% of Jamaica's entire gross domestic product. And Washington's position was that these people, these nurses, these engineers, these teachers, these entrepreneurs, might become a burden on the American state. The irony is not subtle. But before we go any further, let me tell you something about those 1.5 million Jamaicans living in the United States, because their story is the foundation of everything that follows. They did not arrive and start extracting. They arrived and started building. In New York City, nurses have been filling the gaps in understaffed hospitals for decades. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when healthcare systems across America were collapsing under the weight of a global crisis, Jamaican healthcare workers showed up. They worked double shifts. They held the hands of patients whose families could not get to them. They kept wards running when other staff were too afraid to come in. In Miami, Jamaican entrepreneurs have built businesses that employ hundreds of American workers. Businesses that pay American taxes, that contribute to American pension funds, that generate economic activity in communities that needed it. In Atlanta, in Chicago, in Boston, in Toronto, in London, Jamaicans are not sitting in waiting rooms asking for handouts. They are in classrooms, in operating theaters, in law offices, in construction sites. They are doing the work. And every month, without being asked, without being required, without a government program mandating it, they take a portion of what they have earned and they send it home. Not because anyone forces them to. Because that is what it means to be Jamaican. You succeed abroad so that the ones you left behind do not have to suffer. That is not a welfare mentality. That is one of the most economically productive forms of wealth transfer that exists in the modern world, and economists across the political spectrum have said so for years. So when the United States government characterized this community, this productive, contributing, remittance-sending community, as a financial liability, they were not just wrong. They were insulting. And Jamaica noticed. The visa suspension was not an isolated event. It was the most visible point in a pattern of pressure that had been building for months. Go back to the 2nd of April 2025. President Donald Trump stood in the Rose Garden of the White House and announced what his administration called Liberation Day. Sweeping tariffs applied broadly, designed to reshape the terms of global trade in America's favor. The Caribbean was not spared. Jamaica was hit with a 10% tariff on all exports entering the United States. Now, if you are thinking 10% does not sound catastrophic, let me give you the context that changes everything. Since 1984, the Caribbean Basin Initiative has been the foundational architecture of trade between the United States and the Caribbean. It was built on a simple principle. Small island economies need preferential access to American markets in order to survive and develop. Duty-free access was not a favor. It was a structural arrangement that acknowledged the reality of size and power asymmetry in the hemisphere. Jamaica had built 40 years of export planning around that arrangement. Rum, coffee, agricultural products, manufactured goods, all of it flowing into the American market without crushing tariff margins, destroying the viability of the trade. In one afternoon, that arrangement was put in serious jeopardy, and Jamaica was not the hardest hit. Guyana, which has recently emerged as one of the fastest-growing oil economies on the planet, was hit with a 38% tariff. 38%. That is not a trade adjustment. That is a penalty. The message from Washington was unambiguous. Behave as we expect or face the consequences. Caribbean leaders were blindsided. Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley described it as a blow to regional economic stability that no one had been given adequate warning to prepare for. The CARICOM private sector organization estimated that the region stood to lose more than $500 million annually from the tariff impact alone. But tariffs were not the only pressure being applied. Let me tell you about the planes. On the last Thursday of nearly every month, a deportation flight lands at Norman Manley International Airport in Kingston. This has been a regular feature of Jamaican life for years. But under the administration that took office in January 2025, the scale shifted dramatically. As of late 2024, more than 5,000 Jamaicans had active deportation orders pending in the United States. That number is larger than the combined total for Trinidad and Tobago, the Bahamas, Barbados, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent. In January 2025, the first deportation flight of the year carried approximately 50 people. By May of the same year, a single flight landed with 107 Jamaicans aboard, the largest deportation flight in recent memory. Foreign Affairs Minister Kamana Johnson-Smith confirmed that approximately 4,000 Jamaicans had received final deportation orders, with around 2,500 confirmed for removal over time. Some of the people on those flights had spent decades in the United States. Some had children born there, children who are American citizens by birth. Some had committed crimes. Others had committed nothing more than allowing visa paperwork to lapse while waiting, sometimes for years, for their applications to be processed through a system that was already overwhelmed before the new administration accelerated enforcement. All of them were returned to a country they had sometimes barely known since childhood, with minimal transition support, into communities that were simultaneously dealing with the economic pressures of the tariff regime and recovering from natural disaster. We will get to the hurricane shortly. But first, let me tell you about the moment that made headlines around the world and revealed exactly how little diplomatic restraint Washington was prepared to exercise. In late February 2026, the 50th regular meeting of CARICOM heads of government convened in St. Kitts. Regional leaders gathered to discuss the collective challenges facing Caribbean nations: trade policy, climate vulnerability, food security, and the growing complexity of managing relationships with major powers in an increasingly unpredictable global environment. Prime Minister Andrew Holness of Jamaica took the floor and made a statement about Cuba. It was measured, it was carefully worded. It was exactly what you would expect from a responsible regional leader acknowledging a humanitarian situation in a neighboring country. He noted the energy shortages that had been causing rolling blackouts across Cuba for months. He noted the economic hardships that were pushing more Cubans toward desperation. And he made the observation, which any serious analyst of Caribbean migration and security would immediately recognize as accurate, that a prolonged crisis in Cuba would not stay contained within Cuba's borders. It would produce migration flows. It would create security pressures. It would have consequences for the entire region, including Jamaica. There was nothing provocative about this statement. It was an honest assessment of regional reality from a leader whose country sits 90 miles from Cuban territory and has historical and demographic ties to the island that go back generations. Washington's reaction was explosive. Congressman Carlos Jimenez, a Republican representing a Florida district with a large Cuban-American constituency, went to social media immediately. He accused Holness and his party of providing cover for what he called a dying dictatorship. He suggested that Jamaica was abandoning its principles and aligning itself with authoritarian interests. And then he issued a threat that diplomatic observers across the Caribbean and beyond described as extraordinary Jamaica, he said, will face the consequences. Let that sentence sit for a moment. A sitting member of the United States Congress publicly threatened a sovereign nation. A nation that is a member of the Commonwealth, a member of CARICOM, a long-standing ally of the United States, for the act of expressing humanitarian concern about energy shortages in a neighboring country, not for arming an adversary, not for breaking a treaty, not for taking any hostile action whatsoever, for saying, in carefully diplomatic language, that human suffering nearby has regional implications. Jamaica will face the consequences. Now here is what makes this threat so revealing and so strategically significant for understanding what happened next. If you say that to a country that has no options, the threat works. The country backs down, issues a clarifying statement, quietly realigns. But what happens when you say it to a country that has spent the previous several years quietly, methodically, and deliberately building alternatives? What happens when the country you are threatening is no longer as dependent on your approval as you assumed? That is exactly the situation Washington walked into. And I want to take a moment here, because if you are watching this from London, from New York, from Toronto, from any city in the world where Jamaicans are building lives and careers and businesses, you need to understand what this moment means for you personally. The visa ban affects your ability to bring family home. The remittance policies affect the money you send every month. The deportation flights affect people in your community who have been in America for decades. The tariff regime affects the economic prospects of the country you still call home, the country you still send money to, the country you want to retire to someday. This is not a foreign policy story happening somewhere far away. This is a story about your family, your community, your island. And if you are not already subscribed to Caribbean Journey, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. We are building toward 10,000 subscribers, and every single one of those subscribers helps us continue telling stories that mainstream media either ignores or oversimplifies. We are here because the Caribbean deserves serious, in-depth analysis, not tourism brochures and not crime headlines. Hit subscribe, and make sure you hit the notification bell so you never miss what we publish next. Now, let me tell you what Jamaica was doing while all of this was happening. Here is the thing about the assumption that Jamaica was simply a small island that would accept whatever it was given. It was built on an outdated model of Caribbean dependence. For decades, that model was accurate. The Caribbean nations had limited alternatives. American markets, American tourists, American investment. These were not luxuries. They were oxygen. The power differential was real and enormous, and Caribbean leaders navigated it with the careful diplomacy of people who understood they were negotiating from a position of structural weakness. But that world has been changing quietly, methodically, in ways that Washington, consumed with its own domestic politics and great power rivalries, apparently failed to track carefully enough. Because while the State Department was drafting its visa suspension notice, and while Congress was writing its tariff schedules, Jamaica had already been laying the foundations of a different kind of future. Let us start with the infrastructure that most people associate with Chinese investment because it is the most visible piece of what has been happening. The North-South Highway, completed in 2016, was financed by a $457 million loan from the China Development Bank and constructed by China Harbor Engineering Company. It connected Ocho Rios in the north to Kingston in the south, a transformation that cut travel time, reduced transport costs, and opened economic corridors that had previously been isolated by the island's mountainous terrain. Before that highway existed, the journey between Jamaica's northern coast and its capital was an exercise in patience and a test of any vehicle's suspension. After it, the movement of goods and people across the island changed in ways that are still compounding economically a decade later. But Chinese infrastructure involvement in Jamaica did not stop at one highway, road rehabilitation projects, port development, urban revitalization. Chinese companies and Chinese financing have been present across multiple sectors of Jamaican development. The South Coastal Road Reconstruction and Upgrade Project, financed by the Export-Import Bank of China, is improving traffic capacity along Jamaica's southeastern coast, a region of economic significance that had been underserved by infrastructure for years. And then there is the project that, if it reaches its full potential, would represent the largest single foreign investment in Jamaican history. Officials from Gansu province in China announced readiness to invest up to $6 billion to develop an industrial park and special economic zone in St. Elizabeth. $6 billion. In one project, in a country whose entire GDP is approximately $21 billion. If that investment is fully realized, it would reshape the economic geography of Jamaica in ways that are genuinely difficult to overstate. Now, I want to address something directly because it is the most common pushback to this kind of analysis. Is Jamaica not simply trading one form of dependency for another? Is it not replacing American leverage with Chinese leverage? Is it not jumping from one large power's orbit directly into another? It is a fair question, and Prime Minister Holness addressed it in terms that reveal exactly what the strategic thinking actually is. He said, "This is not just about a road. This is about Jamaica achieving economic and political independence." Read that carefully. He did not say this is about choosing China. He said this is about independence. The point is not the identity of the partner. The point is the accumulation of alternatives. The deliberate construction of a situation in which no single partner holds monopoly leverage over Jamaica's economic survival. When you have one partner, and that partner can threaten consequences, the threat has teeth. When you have 5 partners, the threat becomes considerably less credible. Jamaica has been building the 5-partner version of its economic future, and China is only one piece of it. In July 2025, Jamaica did something that received almost no attention in Western media, but that represents one of the most strategically significant economic moves the island has made in decades. Jamaica became the 13th CARICOM member state to formally join the Afrexim Bank, the African Export-Import Bank headquartered in Cairo, Egypt. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was not a diplomatic photo opportunity. This was a concrete structural realignment of where Jamaica sits in the global financial architecture. The joining unlocked $1.5 billion in dedicated funding for Jamaica as part of a $3 billion program, allocated across all CARICOM member countries. That money is earmarked for infrastructure, ports, energy systems, telecommunications networks, and small and medium enterprise development. Think about what that means in practical terms. Jamaican businesses will be able to access capital through a financial institution that does not run its decisions through Washington or London or New York. Infrastructure projects will be financeable through channels that do not come with the political conditions that have traditionally been attached to Western development finance. At the signing ceremony, Professor Benedict Orama, the chairman of the Afrexim Bank, spoke about something that carries historical weight far beyond its immediate financial implications. He described this as the reconnection of African and Caribbean economies that have been historically linked, separated by centuries of forced migration and colonial fragmentation, but institutionally severed until now. The Caribbean diaspora's connection to Africa is not abstract. It is genealogical, cultural, and increasingly economic. The Afrexim Bank partnership represents an institutional expression of a relationship that has existed in people's hearts and histories for generations. Prime Minister Holness and Foreign Affairs Minister Kamina Johnson-Smith were both present at the signing. That is not standard practice for routine financial agreements. You send ministers when something matters at the level of national strategy, and CARICOM Chair Mia Motley has been even more explicit about where this is all heading. She has laid out a 4-point strategy for Caribbean resilience in this new era of unpredictable great power behavior. The first point, build new relationships with Africa, Central America, and Latin America, while renewing partnerships with traditional allies on terms of genuine mutual benefit. The second, achieve food security and agricultural self-sufficiency, because a region that cannot feed itself will always be vulnerable to the leverage of those who can. The third, maintain Caribbean unity because a fragmented region is an exploitable region, and those who want to control the Caribbean have always preferred Caribbean nations competing against each other to Caribbean nations presenting a coordinated front. And the fourth, buy local and buy Caribbean, making consumer choices into instruments of regional economic solidarity. Motley has been direct about the philosophy behind this strategy. The Caribbean cannot continue to import what it can grow, manufacture, or provide for itself, not because of anti-Western sentiment, but because self-sufficiency is the only foundation on which genuine sovereignty can be built. When large powers behave unpredictably, when visa bans can appear overnight, when tariffs can be announced in a rose garden ceremony with minimal consultation, when congressional threats can be issued over humanitarian observations, the only reliable protection is the depth of your own alternatives. Jamaica and its Caribbean neighbors are building those alternatives, and Washington is beginning to understand what that means. Now let me tell you about the policy that, more than any other, exposes the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American strategy toward the Caribbean. While all of this was happening, while visas were being suspended, tariffs were being imposed, deportation flights were landing. A piece of legislation was moving through Congress that would have extracted money directly from the pockets of Caribbean families. It was buried inside a bill called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Hidden inside its provisions was a proposal to tax remittances sent from the United States to foreign countries. The original proposal was 5%. After negotiation, it was reduced to 1%, and 1% sounds small until you do the arithmetic. Jamaicans in America send $3.5 billion home every year. 1% of $3.5 billion is $35 million. $35 million that, under this proposal, would be redirected from Jamaican families to the United States Treasury. Not $35 million from Jamaican government coffers. Not $35 million from Jamaican corporations or financial institutions. $35 million taken, dollar by dollar, from the money that a nurse in Brooklyn earns on a night shift and sends to her mother in St. Elizabeth to pay the electricity bill. From the money a construction worker in Atlanta sends to his children in Kingston for their school fees. From the money a teacher in Chicago sends to help her parents rebuild their house after the hurricane. Dr. Karen Dunkley, a former member of the Jamaica Global Diaspora Council, described this as not just bad economics but a betrayal of shared humanity. She was right. But beyond the moral dimension, there is a strategic absurdity here that is worth examining directly. The same administration that accused Jamaicans of being at risk of extracting wealth from the American state is simultaneously implementing a policy to extract wealth from money that Jamaican workers earned legitimately in the United States and want to send to their own families. Who is extracting from whom? For a country where remittances represent nearly 20% of GDP, a 1% tax does not just reduce a financial flow. It touches every sector of the economy. It ripples through household budgets, through small businesses that depend on locally circulating remittance income, through the real estate market, through school enrollment figures, through the ability of families to access private health care when the public system is under strain. Jamaica's foreign minister and prime minister both lobbied against this provision. The diaspora community in the United States organized. The pushback was vocal and sustained. And it is important to understand what this lobbying effort represents, because it is not simply advocacy for a financial policy. It is the diaspora and the homeland operating in coordination, pursuing a shared strategic interest across national borders and institutional categories. That coordination is itself a form of power, quiet civilian organized power, and it is something Washington consistently underestimates. On the 28th of October 2025, Hurricane Melissa made landfall on the western coast of Jamaica, Category 5, the kind of storm that rewrites the geography of wherever it touches. The World Bank's damage assessment placed the total cost at approximately $8.8 billion, roughly 41% of Jamaica's entire gross domestic product for 2024. In a single storm, in a matter of hours, over 156,000 dwellings were damaged. 24,000 were assessed as total losses. The western parishes, which contain a significant portion of Jamaica's hotel and resort capacity, were devastated. Tourism, one of the largest contributors to the national economy, collapsed in the immediate aftermath. The Planning Institute of Jamaica projected an 11 to 13% GDP contraction in the final quarter of 2025. And here is what happened next. Remittances surged. In the months before the storm, remittances to Jamaica had actually been declining, down 4.6% in November compared to the previous year, as the disruption of the storm itself interrupted economic activity and the movement of funds. But in December 2025, something remarkable occurred. Net remittance inflows reached $315.3 million, a 13.6% increase compared to December of 2024, the largest monthly increase recorded during the entire year. That $36.2 million jump in gross inflows was not driven by new immigration or a windfall of wage increases. It was driven by a community responding to a crisis. Jamaicans in New York, London, Toronto, Miami, and cities across the world looked at the news coming out of home, looked at the images of flattened communities and flooded roads and displaced families, and did what Jamaicans do. They sent money, not because a government told them to, not because a relief organization organized a campaign, because their parents were in those communities, their siblings, their grandparents, their neighbors, their home. The same people the United States government had labeled as potential welfare cases pulled together hundreds of millions of dollars in emergency support for a country recovering from a natural disaster. That is who the Jamaican diaspora is. And I want to make something clear that is directly relevant to the American visa policy and what it actually costs, not Jamaica but the United States. Colin Powell, America's first black Secretary of State, the son of Jamaican immigrants, Kamala Harris, America's first female vice president, of Jamaican heritage on her father's side, Patrick Ewing, one of the greatest centers in the history of the National Basketball Association, born in Kingston, Jamaica. These are not edge cases. These are not exceptions that prove a rule. They are a representative sample of what Jamaican immigration has contributed to American society, culture, and governance across generations. When you tell that community that their families back home are potential welfare cases, you are not just being economically inaccurate, you are being historically illiterate. In the middle of all of this, the visa bans, the tariffs, the deportation flights, the congressional threats, the hurricane, Andrew Holness did something that surprised a lot of observers. He did not shout, he did not make theatrical displays of defiance. He did not announce that Jamaica was breaking ties with America or pivoting permanently to China or aligning itself with any adversarial bloc. He did not give Washington the inflammatory headline it might have expected or perhaps wanted, because an inflammatory headline would have made it easy to dismiss Jamaica's concerns as nationalist posturing. Instead, he spoke with the careful, measured precision of a leader who has thought deeply about what actually works for a small nation navigating a world where large nations are making increasingly unpredictable decisions. When asked about the visa ban, Holness acknowledged something that most politicians would reflexively deny, that small states have limited leverage when superpowers make unilateral decisions. He did not pretend that Jamaica could simply force Washington to reverse course. He was honest about the constraints. But then he said something that deserves to be quoted carefully. He said, "We will pursue diplomatic channels, but we are going to pursue even more, making our country the place of choice to live, work, do business, raise families, and retire in paradise." That is not a concession, that is a strategy. It is the strategy of a leader who understands that the best response to external pressure is not anger and confrontation, which gives the party applying pressure exactly the narrative it wants, but the quiet, sustained construction of something better at home. When asked about the deportation flights, Holness was equally measured. He confirmed that Jamaica would accept its citizens, as required under international law, and committed to resources to help returned citizens rebuild their lives and reintegrate economically. He did not grandstand about the injustice of deportations, even where that injustice was real and significant, because grandstanding does not feed families or create employment. And when the congressional threat came, when Congressman Gimenez declared publicly that Jamaica would face consequences, Holness's response was to refer to Jamaica's long history as a consistent voice of reason for small developing countries globally. He reminded the world that Jamaica's positions are not reactive. They are not adopted in response to pressure from any direction, whether that pressure comes from Washington or from anywhere else. Jamaica had taken its position long before others would have sought to enunciate any current position, and Jamaica was not going to abandon its principles under threat. That kind of composure, in the face of a threat issued by a sitting congressman of the most powerful nation on earth, is not passivity. It is confidence. It is the composure of a leader who knows that his country has more options than the person threatening him realizes. And there is evidence that Holness's approach is beginning to yield results, even in the most fraught areas of the relationship. In late January 2026, the United States State Department lowered Jamaica's travel advisory from Level 3, reconsider travel, down to Level 2, which is exercise increased caution. This placed Jamaica at the same advisory level as France, as Italy, as Belgium, as the United Kingdom. For a country where tourism represents one of the largest sectors of the economy, where over 4 million visitors arrived in 2023 alone, and where Americans historically represent the single largest source market, this downgrade matters enormously. It was not an accident. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, during his visit to Kingston in March 2025, had pledged to review the advisory after his meeting with Holness. Jamaica's patient, sustained diplomatic engagement had produced a concrete outcome. That is what quiet strength looks like in practice. I want to step back now and tell you what this story is really about, because what is happening between Jamaica and the United States is not, at its core, a bilateral dispute. It is a case study in something much larger, something that is being watched closely, carefully, and with considerable interest by small and medium-sized nations on every continent. For over a century, the United States has operated with a particular assumption about its role in the Western Hemisphere. The Caribbean has been treated as what American strategists call a sphere of influence, a region where American interests take automatic priority, where American preferences set the agenda, and where Caribbean nations are expected to align themselves with Washington's positions as a condition of receiving basic economic access and diplomatic goodwill. This arrangement was not secret. It was not particularly subtle. And for decades it was effective because the power differential was simply too large for most Caribbean nations to contest. But the world in 2026 is not the world of 1986, or 1996, or even 2006. China has been offering infrastructure investment and development loans across the Caribbean and the Global South for 2 decades, and the terms of those loans, whatever their limitations and risks, do not come with the same political conditionalities that Western financial institutions have historically attached to their assistance. African financial institutions, including the Afreximbank, are building new channels that connect developing economies to each other rather than routing everything through the traditional Western financial hubs. Regional blocs like CARICOM are finding both their voice and their institutional capacity, and a new generation of Caribbean leaders shaped by the experience of climate vulnerability, pandemic response, the debt pressure, and the lived reality of managing small nations in a world that was not designed with small nations in mind, is increasingly unwilling to accept the premise that subordination is the price of survival. What Jamaica is doing right now is not unique. It is representative of a broader shift, a shift that American foreign policy analysts who are paying close attention are documenting with growing concern. The question is whether Washington can adapt its approach before the shift becomes irreversible. If Jamaica succeeds in what it is attempting, if it manages to genuinely diversify its economic partnerships, build a stronger regional coalition, demonstrate that it can maintain its principled positions without catastrophic economic consequences, then every small nation in the Caribbean will have observed the proof of concept, and it will not stop at the Caribbean. Small nations in the Pacific, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, nations that have been navigating the same structural pressure for generations. They are watching what happens in Jamaica. They are watching whether a small island can hold its ground, maintain its dignity, and build something better. If Jamaica can do it, the template exists. That is why the congressional threat was so revealing. Not because Jimenez's words carry the force of official American foreign policy. They do not. But because they reveal what the underlying assumption still is in parts of Washington, that small nations can be brought back into line through the application of sufficient pressure. That assumption is becoming less accurate every year, and Jamaica's response to it is part of the reason why. So where does this go from here? Let me be honest about the complexity, because this story does not have a clean resolution. Jamaica will continue to maintain its diplomatic relationship with the United States. That relationship is too deep, too multidimensional, and too important to the daily lives of too many people on both sides to be simply abandoned. The 1.5 million Jamaicans in America are not going anywhere. The hundreds of millions of dollars in remittances are not going to stop flowing. American tourists, even with all the complications of the past 2 years, still represent Jamaica's largest visitor market. Jamaica does not want to break with America, and America, if it examines its actual strategic interests clearly, does not want to lose Jamaica. What Jamaica wants, what Wholeness has been saying in various formulations for the past several years, is a genuine partnership, a relationship built on mutual respect rather than asymmetric dependence. A relationship in which Jamaica's concerns are heard, in which Jamaica's dignity is not treated as negotiable, and in which the terms of engagement reflect the reality that Jamaica has options and is prepared to use them. The Afrexim Bank membership is not anti-American. The Chinese infrastructure investment is not anti-American. The CARICOM regional solidarity strategy is not anti-American. They are pro-Jamaica. They are the logical moves of a small nation deciding at last to take its own future seriously. And there are signs that at least some corners of Washington understand this. The travel advisory downgrade is significant. Secretary Rubio's visit to Kingston in March 2025, during which he committed to reviewing the advisory and discussed broadening the economic partnership, suggests that at least some American officials recognize the costs of a deteriorating relationship with a Caribbean nation that is building a genuinely credible set of alternatives. The challenge is whether that recognition is deep enough and consistent enough to translate into a sustained shift in American policy toward the region. On the ground in Jamaica, the work of rebuilding from Hurricane Melissa continues. As of late 2025, approximately 70% of Jamaica's hotel room inventory had returned to operational status, with projections to reach 80% by the first quarter of 2026. Tourism officials project that visitor numbers will gradually approach pre-hurricane levels by the end of 2026, assuming continued stability in American travel confidence and no further major weather events. For the diaspora, for the Jamaican in London, the Jamaican in Toronto, the Jamaican in New York, the practical implications are real and ongoing. The visa ban continues to affect family reunion plans. The remittance tax debate, while temporarily reduced, is not permanently resolved. Deportation flights continue, but so does the community's response. December's surge in remittances after Hurricane Melissa was not a statistical anomaly. It was a statement, a demonstration of the bond between diaspora and homeland that no visa ban and no tariff and no congressional threat can dissolve. I want to end with something that I think is easy to miss when you are tracking the statistics and the diplomatic maneuvers and the geopolitical chess moves. This story is at its core about something very simple. It is about whether a nation of less than 3 million people on a small island in the Caribbean Sea has the right to determine its own destiny, not the right to be rich, not the right to be powerful, not the right to bend large nations to its will or to conduct its affairs without consequence or complexity. Just the basic right, the right that every nation claims for itself, to make decisions based on its own values and its own assessment of what serves its people. The right to speak honestly about humanitarian conditions in a neighboring country without a foreign congressman threatening consequences. The right to build economic partnerships with whoever offers genuinely beneficial terms, without being treated as a diplomatic traitor. The right to say, in plain language, that the relationship must benefit both parties. That is all that Jamaica is asking for. And the fact that this request, this thoroughly reasonable, thoroughly normal request, has produced the level of reaction it has from Washington tells you something important about the assumptions that still govern American foreign policy in the Caribbean. The assumption that small nations do not get to have standards, that small nations should accept the terms they are given and be grateful. Jamaica is demonstrating that this assumption is wrong, not through confrontation, not through hostility, through the patient, methodical, strategically intelligent construction of a future in which Jamaica's survival and prosperity do not depend on any single partner's goodwill. Prime Minister Wholeness put it as clearly as anyone could. Jamaica will pursue diplomatic channels, but Jamaica will also build its own country. Build its own country. not wait for permission, not hold its positions hostage to the approval of a foreign government. Build, that is the story. And whether Jamaica's strategy ultimately succeeds or faces setbacks along the way, whether the Chinese investment delivers on its promise, whether the Afreximbank partnership grows into something transformative, whether the CARICOM coalition can maintain the unity and discipline it needs to be effective. The attempt itself matters, because the Caribbean has watched for over a century what happens when small nations accept the premise that their size determines their worth, that their geography makes them permanently subordinate, that the best they can do is manage their dependence rather than build their independence. Jamaica is testing a different premise, and the entire Caribbean and a good portion of the rest of the world is watching to see whether it is right. If you have stayed with this story to the end, I want to thank you, not with a formality, but because it genuinely means something, that you are one of the people who wants to understand what is actually happening in the Caribbean, rather than the surface-level version. If this raised questions for you, if it challenged what you thought you knew, if there is a piece of this story you want me to dig into more deeply, put it in the comments. I want to know what you think about Jamaica's strategy. I want to know whether you think Washington will adjust its approach or whether the pressure will continue to escalate. I want to know whether you have family who have been directly affected by the visa ban, the deportation orders, or the remittance tax proposals. Those comments are not just engagement metrics. They are the foundation of what this channel builds. Every perspective from someone inside this community, whether you are in Kingston or in London or in Toronto or in New York, adds something to this conversation that I cannot produce alone. And if you are not yet subscribed, now is the moment. We are working toward 10,000 subscribers, and we are building this community one viewer at a time. Hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and come back for the next story, because there is a great deal more to tell. The Caribbean is not a backyard, it is not a footnote, it is not a tourist brochure. It is a region of 300 years of extraordinary history, navigating some of the most consequential shifts in global power since the Cold War ended. And this channel is here to tell that story with the seriousness it deserves.